Well, welcome everybody. My name's Kyle Fickler. I'm assuming I know most of you. For me, the biggest challenge is typically I do this live, which I prefer because then I can see who's nodding off, who's paying attention, who has a question. So a little different on my end, but in these interesting times, thought this was a unique opportunity to maybe reach out and instead of doing our typical program where our goal is to bring the PRI show and the SEMA show to you as customers and you as reps. In this situation, what we're doing 6 of these where we're kind of taking little subsets of that information, breaking them down into smaller quantities. In some areas, going a little bit deeper than we might normally. The session we did this morning was kind of a product update and a little bit of a look forward. This will be a little bit different in that it will be more, I think, traditional tech. We have some new products to talk about in filters and regulators, but I've spent the last, I always pick up some tech calls, but the last, I guess, eight or 9 business days now, been taking a ton since we were staying at home. And it kind of brings back some of these issues and makes you realize how things that, you've been in front of for 25 years, the consumer changes, the trends change, in our case, between E85 and just increasingly high horsepower numbers. Some of what we used to think of on the filtration and regulator side has changed. And also there's one little note I'll drop in the middle of this about our Gen 2 tanks. It's kind of changed how we look at a few things as well. So although it's just filters and regulators, I think we'll do our best to pull in enough other product, enough other tech to make it interesting for you. So, but once again, just wanted to say thank you. I know even in these most interesting times, this isn't the only thing you have gone, or you could potentially be doing at 12 o'clock Central on a Thursday. So I appreciate the time, and I'll try to make it worth your while. Guess I need to use this thing too. We have more than 50 fuel pressure regulators, and that didn't happen overnight. They all serve a very specific purpose. We have a couple instances where you have color options. As the company's matured, we've realized you need to introduce things in all black. So you've seen us probably trend away from our red and black a little bit, but there's a reason for all of them. There's a story behind all of them. We aren't going to talk about all of them today because, as Jake said, I've only got 30 minutes, but what we'll do is we'll try to dive in. We're focused primarily on the return style regulator, whether it's carbureted or EFI, primarily EFI. But you guys know the line well enough to know that we do stuff to solve problems. It's not just to introduce a new part number and aggravate everybody's purchasing side. I leave this cutaway in the deck for a couple of reasons. We've all held hundreds of regulators, but we don't always take the time just to kind of visualize how the fuel flows. So I'm leaving this in there just to show that you can come in either side of that. That's basically our old 13101. But what I want you to imagine is the fuel coming in either side, and that white, realize you just can't see my finger, can you? Where you see that little gray ball, little blue ball, and then the diaphragm, the spring assembly on top of it. How that regulator works is it lifts that diaphragm off of that seat where it's sitting. So in that position, it's actually closed, which that regulator will never be closed. Over the years, Brett and I always commented we should have had that redone with that ball open, because if it closed, the pump shut off basically. But that's how that fuel flows up, makes that turn up towards the diaphragm, and then makes that 180-degree turn down, returns out the bottom. So just leaving that in there for that reason. One other thing I always think of when I look at this cutaway, though, if you have customers that are saying, hey, I think I have a failed diaphragm, or I have a bad spring, or something like that, when tech gets down to that level, you'll see, if you're looking at this, if you see it the way I do, the diaphragm is the only thing that separates the fuel from atmosphere, if you will. So if they have a failed diaphragm, you can see pretty clearly they will have gas coming out of the boost reference port on the side, on the vacuum port on the side. At that point, the diaphragm really is just sealing the two halves of the regulator. So that's why I leave that in there. Sometimes I think I overlook that and take for granted that everybody really knows how that bypass regulator functions. We started there at 13101 a few years ago. We introduced Gen 2 of our next generation of our A1000 regulators. Addressed several things. It was more than just adding 3 new SKUs into the picture. Up until this point, we didn't have anything with a -8 port other than the X1. We didn't have or the big advantage being able to go back, look at 13109, look at 13101, take some mass out of it. I think these are about 30% lighter, if I remember right, than a 13101 or 109. You can see all the weight we took out of the body. Same basic performance. The real key is where you see patent pending. That it has now been granted, and so I'll update that photo where it has the patent number. You can see that on the 3rd bullet there on the left. But that is patent protection in China rather than the U.S. And a real tip of the cap to Steve and Jack for going through the effort to get that kind of protection, because as you guys know, we've been on the forefront of the counterfeit product or anti-counterfeit product movement in our industry for a long, long time. And that doesn't happen by accident. But this is one of the products, obviously one of our most counterfeited products. So it was worth the effort to get that patent protection. And one of the reasons we're really proud of those two. So available in a -6, -8, and -10. Nice small little regulator, and obviously all black. So this is where I want to jump in on talk about Gen 2 tanks a little bit. Brett, if it was in Brett's world, Brett Clow, our senior tech, he would have had part number 13220 about 15 years ago probably. What this is taking a 13301 regulator and a 13205 regulator and combining them into one part. Where this really comes into play, I always think of like a V8S10 or something where the consumer, where the enthusiast is wanting to use as much of the OE fuel system as he can with an in-tank pump and with whatever plumbing, is available on that OE side, typically too small for a carbureted system, obviously. And back in the day, Brett would recommend those 2 part numbers and all the plumbing to do it. But the reality was that that enthusiast was typically oriented towards the budget side. And if it wasn't the cost of the 2 regulators, it was the cost of the plumbing. And then he was off to Home Depot to buy, some god-awful brass 90s to put it all together. So the engineering team came up with 13220. You guys understand the principle. It's where we have an OE in-tank pump typically, and we're trying to shortcut some of the plumbing rather than run, braided hose the entire length or some other plumbing solution. So where this touches home with our Gen 2 tanks is we have learned, the science proves it out, but the way our consumers use our Gen 2 tanks in carbureted applications, even with a -8 return line on the carbureted side, we're having some challenges going through that OE top plate. There's not enough real estate there probably to do it the way we wanted. We're seeing enough of a restriction there that instead of recommending just a 13301 or a 13204 or 13304, we're leaning towards this 13220 in carbureted Gen 2 applications. How that solves the issue, instead of returning the fuel at 6 or 7 psi as you would with just a return style regulator, we're returning it at 14 or 16 psi through the bypass side, the 13301 side of this regulator, and then not knocking it down to carbureted pressure on the deadhead on the 13205 side. So if you're looking at that regulator, basically it just enters on that front side, the port under the 13305, returns out the bottom of the 13301 side. You can't see all the ports available there, but the key being that that higher bypass pressure right sizes the restriction on that return line, if you will, and that's how we're able to get it back down to the pressure you want. That being said, whether it's EFI or carbureted on the return side, there's a real simple way to check that you don't have a restriction greater than the regulator itself. If you're in a carbureted system and you want 7, make sure with the engine running you can adjust it down to 5.5 or 6 psi. That tells you once again that the return line is not a greater restriction. On EFI, it's a little different because you have to disconnect the vacuum hose so that you don't have some kind of a vacuum pull off as a reference. And there's no magic to the number, just 1, 2, 3 psi below whatever you want your set pressure to be. It's a good idea whether it's EFI or carbureted. I bet I've told that story 3-4 times a day over the last 6 or 7 days, just helping guys, because the returns style systems are so much more common than they used to be. So if you have a consumer looking at a Gen 2 tank in a carbureted application, either yourself or me or Brett or somebody, talk to them about 13220 and just see if we can get over that hump a little bit with some of those guys. So regulator on the bottom, a real reflection of what we're seeing in terms of fuel volume. Dash 12 ports on an EFI regulator. You guys know how much fuel you can push through a dash 12 port. So a real reflection of what we're seeing just in terms of pump size, with our 7 gallon a minute, our 10 gallon a minute brushless stuff that we'll be talking about, I think, later today. Double adjustable. This is one of my favorite Airmotive stories, but it is a bypass style regulator. Started out years ago when Steve was running Super Comp, NHRA Super Comp, driving a car that had an alcohol dominator on it. And at the time, dominators had notoriously bad idle quality and part throttle quality, and almost to the point where zero fuel pressure at low RPM was the goal. So Steve being Steve, this kind of became a pet project for him. And basically how it works, you're looking at that cutaway there again. Fuel would enter, it'd be, I believe, on your right side of the screen. Fuel enters there. Once again, it's going to push the valve off the seat. In this case, looks like the ball off the seat. That little needle valve on the left side, that's how you set the idle pressure, the low pressure. What that does, that creates a leak path that allows that's a less of a restriction than the regulator itself. We're able to take advantage of something that simple by the simple fact that we're dealing with a belt drive pump. So we have a variable speed pump. In our case, our 6 gallon a minute pump, I think, was maybe a gallon and a half at that real low RPM. It ramps up real quickly, and as it ramps up, it doesn't even know that leak's there. Why I mention this now, because obviously that's a story about 15 years ago, is this has become the go-to piece in the dirt world. Started out with some dirt modified racers in Iowa. Pretty soon, Scott Bloomquist and some of the dirt late model guys got a hold of it. The real story is if you're, keep in mind, a lot of those guys at the time were transitioning from block mounted mechanical pumps to belt drive, just because between NASCAR and everybody else, the OEs were not producing blocks with provisions for block mounted pumps. So as they went to belt drive pumps, they needed a solution. The beauty of this thing is they roll into a corner, they come into a corner, back out of the throttle to set the back of the car. This is so much cleaner because you don't get that huge pressure spike and the thing would go dead rich. Instead, because this regulator goes to the low pressure side and they don't have to run artificially high pressure anyway. It's just cleaner through the middle of the corner. They roll off much, much cleaner, and just a really neat little piece with two completely different stories behind it that have made it successful. The X1, other than 13301, we never really had a universal regulator, if you will. What makes this thing cool is the ability to switch between EFI and carbureted. Yes, people do it. I've seen them just in the past 8 days, I guess. I've seen people go both directions. How it works is you just change the color-coded seat in it. Obviously, it's a different spring for EFI and carbureted. And then the orifice size. The big EFI has a 313 orifice. Has a big 313 orifice. The carbureted has a 313 orifice, and then the smaller, the Phantom A1000 EFI, has a 188 orifice. So those three elements really, they describe how you build an effective regulator. You have to have, the right spring, you can tell there just by looking at the springs, how much thinner the wire is on the carbureted spring. It's a lower pressure spring. The number of wraps, the temper of the wire, all those things factor into play. And then if you look at the red seat, you'll notice that the orifice on that is much smaller than the black seat. So those three elements are really the key to good regulator performance. And it's, as you guys know from talking with our engineers, it's not simple. So how that works, and I think you guys know this, is you can buy any one of those three and then just buy a conversion kit, which is the 3 parts pictured there to swap back and forth. Stackable regulators. This, these things, what I've found on the sales and marketing side is you'll find customers that just really appreciate how nice a piece these are. When when this deal started years ago, the Holly Blue 2-port was the go-to regulator, and these big nitrous systems. This modular concept, we cleaned up a lot of the plumbing issues. You can use it in either a deadhead or a bypass style configuration. The modularity on them is really, it simplifies the plumbing so much. Sometimes I think, people forget that we have them. I want to point out the top picture too. We have a adapter fitting that has a jam nut. As you guys know, our stuff's all AN rather than pipe thread. So to clock those 3 gauges correctly, our engineering team came up with an AN fitting that has a jam nut so that you can, that's just a cool looking piece. I had to look cool sitting on your desk. It doesn't have to be on a race car. So we mentioned we have 50. The 3 elements we talked about on the X1, they apply to everything. If you're at a swap meet trying to help a customer and he's not sure what regulator he has, if it's an Airmotive regulator, if it has a boost reference port on it, if it has that nipple in the cap, it's a return style regulator. None of our deadhead regulators have the hose barb in the side, have the boost reference port. Convoluted diaphragms, didn't touch on that. We've had some competitors over the years that used a flat diaphragm. The challenge there is every time it opens, it has to stretch. So what we mean by a convoluted diaphragm is it has a bellows in it or has a hinge in it that's meant to help it open and close. And just, some of our stuff's a little bit more expensive than everybody else. It's just whether it's the spring, whether it's the diaphragm, all those simple little parts people take for granted are the things that we really put a lot of extra effort into. Can't talk about regulators without talking about fuel pressure gauges. In our history, we went through the battle of we knew the challenge with liquid-filled gauges long ago. There's a really good tech bulletin, I think 903 on our website, that has about 5 pages that tells that story real well. What ends up happening is a consumer buys an Airmotive regulator, scrimps on the gauge, and just gets a sealed liquid-filled gauge. How that plays out is as the gauge warms up, as the engine warms up, because they're engine mounted typically, the glycerin inside the gauge body expands. When it expands, it straightens out the board-on tube or the C-tube inside the gauge. That gives you an artificially low pressure reading. Then I'll throw this back to my carbureted life. Guy buys that regulator, he sets it to 7 PSI, drives to the liquor store. Jake's heard this story 100 times. Drives to the liquor store, neighbor had seen the hood up, pops the hood, shows him, but he sees, it's down like 5.5 PSI or 6 PSI. So he drives home, sets it back up to 7 PSI, comes out in the morning, he's got 9 PSI. Well, you know what happens then. He calls Jake on Monday morning, says he needs an RGA for a regulator. What was really happening is what we described with the glycerin expanding. So how we solve that issue with these gauges is that little equalizer pin, you just basically burp the gauge so that the pressure inside the gauge body was higher than atmospheric. You just burp it, let that equalize. So really simple little tool. That gauge retails for $42. It's not much more expensive than any other gauge out there. But one of those little things over the years that we've come to understand that, we have to solve all the problems. You can't just stop at build a regulator and hand it to the customer and tell them good luck. We need to solve all those other issues as well. This is, and a few of you guys have heard this. I just threw a little tech blog up on the Airmotive site a few weeks ago about this too. About as soon as we introduced our 340 pumps, we started seeing some distinct characteristics coming through the warranty department. And at the time, we weren't sure what it was. Figured out rather quickly it was the use, and it's really a common piece, but basically the C5 Corvette filter regulator combo. The factory GM piece, Delco piece, was probably worked okay with a 255 liter per hour pump. What ended up happening, especially in our tank and Phantom line, is we got more of them out there. And of course, we started with 340. We started to learn that this thing is so restrictive that it just kills those pumps. I don't have a problem with our 200, but anything in the Airmotive line bigger than our 200, it's an absolute no-no. what ends up happening, it's so restrictive internally that it just pushes the amperage draw through the roof. You'll still see 58 PSI at the TBI unit or at the rail, but the reality is that head pressure at the outlet of the pump is much higher than that. It's working its butt off to push the fuel through this combination regulator filter, and it's working so hard that when the amperage draw goes up, heat goes up, clearances close up, and it's just a vicious cycle. So working really hard the past couple of years to just make the world aware of this. It's pretty rare we talk about something that's not an Airmotive product. There's part of me that knows that as this thing has been in the aftermarket for years, that's what in the aftermarket is probably not as good as what General Motors' original spec was. So whether it's a Gen 2 tank or a Phantom, if you know of customers that use these as a habit, don't let them use it with an Airmotive pump. It's just about a guaranteed return on them. Filters.
You're about 20 minutes in, sir.
Now what?
You're 20 minutes in.
Okay. Filters. Filters are an area that early on we took credit, and I think rightfully so, for kind of pioneering the concept of marketing filters by micron rating. I don't know that that at the time anybody put a lot of thought into that, but we knew early on that as efficient as that A1000 was, we really needed to focus on minimizing suction side restriction. So you guys have been around a while, remember that it was almost like a church sermon where my goal in every face-to-face seminar was just to get everybody to remember S and S, P and P, suck through stainless, push through paper. That is still true. It's changed a little bit with the 85 and now having microglass and things like that, but the same basic, the physics behind it are still absolutely true. I've become more definitive about saying it isn't just 100 micron, it's also a minimum of 60 square inches of filter media. And that's on our 12604 replacement element. You guys have all seen it. How we get that is all those pleats. And there are people out there with similar body size, that 2-inch diameter, 5-inch, 5.5-inch long, exact same dimensions. You look at their element, it might be 15 square inches or 20 square inches. If it has 8 or 10 pleats, it's just not, there's no comparison. So that's something we're really trying to avoid. So remember S and S, P and P. If you don't remember anything else, come out of today. We have, as you guys know, the filter matrix, if you're familiar with the Airmotive catalog on page 40, is an absolute dream because we have a lot of filters as well, but that little matrix is a real nice breakdown of our 140 10 micron paper and 10 micron microglass. We now have the male-ended filters in all black. That little in-tank pre-filter has become real popular with race car, with chassis builders, with front-mounted fuel cells so they can mount the pump directly to the cell. The little bracket at the bottom retails for about $20, part number 12701. That's what we developed for the Copo, Cobra Jet, and Drag Pack programs. It's actually spring steel that's kind of rubber coated, so it snaps around the filter. It is a really neat little piece that I like a lot. Easy add-on sale. The Pro Series went from electroless nickel to black about a year ago, and our most recent filter is that second tab, which is a -16 ORB, and it is huge. It's the filter there that Barron has his hand on. That's a Pro Series on the other side, and that Pro Series is 2 5/8 inch diameter. I think 7 inches long. Look how much bigger that -16 filter is. She's a monster. So I mentioned earlier 60 square inches. You'll see that on the top. That's a 12604 element. What we really want to avoid is those other four. Those little disc filters like on the bottom. I mean, you're at a square inch right there. So if you have a Target Master 305 block mounted mechanical fuel pump, 205 horse or something on a street rod, you're probably fine, but we don't want to see those kind of filters anywhere in an Airmotive system. Already teased you with that. So just remember number of pleats. I was talking earlier about return line size, how you check that. For those of you familiar with our power planner in the back of the catalog, years ago, we used to see -6 return line. I'd think about A1000 carbureted and A1000 EFI, just making that regulator swap. I'll tell you, we're starting to even see the EFI stuff go up to -8 as well, just because that A1000 gets better, all the time, just continuous improvement, whether it's motor, just efficiencies. So pay close attention to that power planner. What you see today isn't what you would have seen 10 years ago. And, as we were talking about on that 13220 with a carb-rated Gen 2, -6 is going to be too small, no matter whether it was a Gen 1 tank or a Gen 2 tank or a Phantom. Minimum of -8 return in those applications. Although at 16 PSI at that 13220, I think there's some guys out there getting away with -6. So it's not an easy question, a lot to think about there. I'll remind you again about S&S, P&P, suck through stainless, push through paper. And so back to those little filters there at the bottom, those little disc filters, that exactly describes this line at the bottom. And it's painful to say when you sell fuel system components, but the wrong filter is almost always a worse scenario than no filter. With no filter, the pump may get contaminated and fail, but with that wrong filter, we know it's going to happen. We even see it that Corvette filter regulator combo. Let me open it up for some questions. There's my email address and an extension. If you have something you want to follow up in person or next week or something like that. But any questions I can jump to while I look at my notes?
Yeah, and if everybody, or if you're looking at getting the free shirt for doing the training session, I've got the link in the chat, so hopefully you guys can see that. But you covered the return line on the carbureted applications, right, Kyle?
Yeah, and that all fits together with that 13220. I mean, it's a minimum of -8. Or historically has been. Our Gen 2 tanks, just completing the story, I guess, generally come out with a -6. The 13220, it's easier to plumb it that way with a -6, but man, at that point, you really need that 14 or 16 PSI of return pressure to make that work. And it's one of those that in some respects, our life gets a little bit more complicated, even when we're trying to provide, adequate solutions. I want to touch on the suction side one more time too, where that 100 micron and 60 square inches comes in, is we're just trying to minimize any kind of restriction on the suction side. As you guys know, when you put fuel under a vacuum, which obviously you do to suck it out of the tank with an external pump, when you put it under a vacuum, it drops the boiling point. Well, the gas we're buying in 2020 compared to what we might have been buying in 2000 or 1994, it just gets less vacuum friendly every day, for the simple fact that the last OE went in tank in 1986. So if you're a fuel blender, you don't give any consideration to put fuel under a vacuum, because everybody's pump is in the tank. That's why you hear us harping so much about not only micron rating, 100 micron rating, nothing finer than that, but also surface area. So most of what we talk about, the smallest filter we recommend is 60 square inches. And you guys know, looking at that picture, that -16, I don't know what it is. I'll have to have one of the engineers pull up the spec on it. But gosh, that thing's got to be 160 or something. It just dwarfs that, even that Pro Series filter. So that's where it all comes into play. One other little note I'll throw out too: if you have a customer that is buying a Gen 2 tank and installing a Phantom, and he's doing a lot of plumbing, when he buys his pressure side filter, the -10 paper, have him buy that 12601 replacement element when he buys all those other components. We'd like to see him replace that element at 100 miles or 3 or 4 tanks of gas or something like that, just whenever it's convenient to go in and service the car. We know from personal experience that when you're making hoses, when you're installing a new tank, when you're installing a Phantom, it doesn't matter how clean you are. Fuel is such a good solvent. It's gonna do a better job cleaning that system than you ever will. And the dirtiest that system, a properly functioned system, will ever be is those first couple tanks of gas. So the sooner we replace that pressure side element, the happier that system will be over the long run. If they buy it with all their other stuff, they aren't paying, $20 freight for a $16 filter element. And that's why I just recommend buying it on the front side. That way they don't have any excuses.
Richie brought up a good point. Would you talk about how to see, or the differences between the Counterfeit, how to see the Counterfeit versus the Airmotive authentic regulator?
Great question. Thanks, Richie. So it's real easy if they're side by side. But the one thing that you will notice visually is most of the counterfeit stuff, it's the quality of the fasteners, how they're plated, quality of that hose barb on the side, boost reference, how it's plated. A lot of times they will use a black 8th NPT plug, whereas ours is brass. Those three things are probably the most obvious. And those are on the high quality counterfeit. The low quality counterfeit, their A looks more like an inverted U or something like that. So there's a lot of little things. The other things that come into play, a lot of the guys that knock off the regulators like to include red and blue fittings, which we don't do. They like to put it in styrofoam packaging, which we never do. So those kinds of things, and even the best quality knockoffs. So if you look at the quality of the plating and the fasteners, even sometimes the bracket, things like that. I got a counterfeit product removed from eBay middle of last week, and they had 4 photographs on their page. 3 of them were our photographs, and 1 of them was there, and theirs was the one on the first page. But man, when I opened those photographs up side by side, and my heart told me, gosh, I hope a consumer can look and realize that, out of those 4, which one's different, that if 3 are alike and one's different, that tells you a pretty good story. So.
Peter asked if there's a weight difference at all.
Weight difference on what?
On the knockoffs.
That's a good question. We've got a few of them here. I'll have to weigh them. I mean, I think they do a reasonably good job of digitizing the body. At least the exterior surfaces. We all know their machining standards aren't near as high. I mean, they don't hold tolerances, or they appear to try not to hold tolerances. But I would think they probably weigh pretty close. Are you thinking about a scenario where the shipping department or a scale in a shipping department or something should catch them too?
I would think maybe just seeing them, feeling them in hand.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to make a note of that and see. At least we can weigh the ones that we have here in house.
Yeah, side by side, you should be able to tell the difference. Is there any size difference too, Kyle?
Well, the guys that are counterfeiting the stuff, I think, they're trying to. I mean, the easiest part for them to knock off is the body, right? Just the nature of CNC equipment. To get a high quality fastener and high quality plating and stuff like that, you actually got to spend the money. So, although even with CNC equipment, I had a gentleman 3-4 years ago who thought he had a 13301. It was a counterfeit piece, and with the 20 to 60 psi pressure spring in there, the threads in that thing were bad enough that when he was trying to adjust the pressure on the regulator, it was tearing the threads out of the aluminum cap. So I don't know. My guess is probably a combination of the plating on the adjusting screw and just a lousy machine shop that built that. And I can guarantee it wasn't 6000 series aluminum. So it's all the little details still matter.
Yeah, Adam has a good idea. Maybe in the next session or future sessions, if we have a imitation so that we can kind of show them side by side, because we can see you. So if we could maybe grab some over, that'd be an awesome idea there.
That is a good idea. Matter of fact, we've got a few on our website. So far, I've been reluctant to roll the website in with my IT department maxed out.
Yep. No problem there. Richie wants to know how often the service regulators and filters.
Great question. So, yeah, great question. When it comes to regulators, and we kind of talked about if, diaphragm failure, I had this call yesterday. Diaphragm failure literally means that there's going to be gas coming out of the boost reference port. I've got a pretty well-known dirt late model guy, real well-known, as a matter of fact, that he has 3 of those regulators across his engine lineup. And we were trying to figure out how in the dirt track world to come up with a maintenance program. As drag racers, it's easy. You make a quarter-mile lap, you drive back to the trailer, you made 1 run, And working with him, about the only thing I could come up with is, okay, how many drums of fuel did you buy last year? And then just started doing some math, not trying to count laps, because they might be on a quarter-mile bull ring or a half mile, like like Eldora or something like that. So, but just the number of gallons of fuel he burnt, and divided that among the 3 regulators, and he decided he's going to replace diaphragm every 2 years in those. Just, he's a pro level racer. The filter side depends a lot on a couple factors. What fuel are you running? You guys all know E85 is real dirty. I mean, even the best E85 is pretty dirty. It's an organic compound at some level, or some portion of it is. So that answers one question, I guess. We have a tech bulletin on our website about how to properly clean stainless elements. I'm guilty as anybody. That suction side 100 micron stainless, as long as I've got brake clean or carb clean, compressed air, and maybe a toothbrush, I think I'm good to go. Brett is for life. Brett has done a good job convincing me that we need to start thinking about ultrasonic cleaners if we're going to, really expect that kind of life out of a stainless steel element. I run race gas. It's always in a drum. It goes through a filter just going into the tank. My funnel has a filter in it. I don't race very much, so my filters last a long time. The paper elements on that pressure side, like the 12601 I referenced, if you've got a typical hot rod that only sees 2,000 or 3,000 miles a year of driving at the most, and you're running pump gas, it's $16 to replace that element in the spring when you fire the car up, and that's pretty cheap insurance. Or at least leave the element in the top of the toolbox and pull the body apart and just look and see what's in there. I've had scenarios with the paper element a few years ago where dye from a well-known fuel brand, the dye was so highly concentrated that even after just short service life, you'd pull those paper elements out and they were a completely different color. And had a few episodes where we started seeing changes in system performance, and I think the racers convinced themselves and me that it was dye buildup on these cars. As one of the factory muscle car programs, the dye buildup in a pretty common fuel was heavy enough to plug up filters. So I wish there were simple, easy answers. We kind of point out on the website about how to clean them and what we'd like to see you do with that first or that fresh install when you have a new tank or new fuel cell and all new plumbing. Get it out of there in 100 miles or a couple tanks of fuel, whatever. There's no set answer, just that needs to be some convenience, but we just want to make it a bigger priority. By the way, the microglass elements, they look like stainless, but you can't clean them. It's actually almost like a fiberglass mat. They're disposable as well, even though they have some kind of a silvery metallic finish to them.
Did you also hit on mounting brackets at all?
12701 I touched on in there a little bit, and then we've got some billet brackets, 12305 for the 2-inch filters. We've got a pretty cool, I don't have a good picture of it, I don't think, but a rotating clamp, 11703, I believe, which rotates, which is more of a show car piece, I guess. And then what we're seeing more and more on the race side, and we have them now for that dash 16 filter I talked about, is 12702 and I believe 12703 are the stainless steel T-bolt, a real industrial stainless clamp that are, rubber lined, incredibly strong. Out of all of them, from just a volume and that kind of 80-20 rule, that 12701, the little spring steel clamp is a really popular piece. Comes with stainless hardware, real easy to install. The black coated finish looks good on the black filter bodies, and nice little piece. And it's really lightweight. It's probably the lightest weight we have by far. Two things I didn't talk about, just jumping back in, we have those shutoff filters as well. I think they're in the presentation, but we have dash 10 and dash 12 ORB shutoff filters, have a ball valve in the end. Where I see those a lot, and because there's always 2 of them, is King of the Hammers, just the off-road world, whether it's a trophy truck or an Ultra 4. You think about those guys out in the desert, they usually have 60 or 80 gallons of fuel on board. And so if they need to do some kind of infield service, it's nice to be able to shut that fuel flow off. Saw a few of them this year at Tulsa Shootout. You know, there's a few of them in the dirt track world. Ours tends to be a little more expensive made than some of the other stuff they can buy. We also have a line of filters that have a port on the outlet side for a variety of reasons that, you know, some guys will put a pressure gauge there to actually measure head pressure against the pump. But you can do all kinds of things with those two big dual outlet filters available in both the dash 10 and dash 12 ports. Don't get a chance to talk about them much, but they're a really nice piece. By the way, thinking out loud here again, when you're looking at that matrix, if your customer buys, you know, a 12304, so it's 100 micron in the red 10 ORB body, those replacement elements fit all the way across that line. So regardless of which body they may have, which color it is, whether it's ORB, whether it's AN, there's a replacement element where they could change that from 100 micron to 10 micron to 10 micron microglass to 40 micron stainless steel. So engineers do a great job of that, where we're sharing those components all across the line. And if you're relatively new to Airmotive, be thankful now that we actually laser engrave the micron rating on the end of the filter so that you don't have to disassemble it to figure out which one you have. You can look in the end of the filter body, look in there, and you'll see 100M, 10M, 40M, stuff like that.
The only thing, double adjustable fuel logs and stuff like that. I don't think we have too much as far as fuel logs and fittings go, as far as covering that stuff in the future. So if you just want to hit on that, if anybody wants to jump off, they're plenty fine too. But
so we have a telescoping log, and when we introduced our telescoping log, we had another feature that nobody else had, and basically there's a ball and socket assembly that allows 20 degrees of rotation away from a vacuum pump fitting, or in my case, a throttle stop, or you know, sometimes a valve cover, just depending on what's coming out of that valve cover. So really nice log. They tend to be, you know, towards the premium side. It'll telescope to fit either 4150 or 4500. And obviously, as the carburetor world has changed, you know, we have the adapter fittings for the Holley HP style bowls, and then the more traditional Dominator bowls. Still some Demons out there. We have Demon fittings. The only thing, or one of the ones that I know we don't fit at current time, is the new APD bowl. I've had a couple of customers request that. They use a tiny hex, just the way they build that. I think it's a 9/16 hex that you end up putting way down the adapter fitting, and we don't have that. But it's definitely a premium piece. It's on the swivel side. It's a Teflon O-ring and a really nice ball and socket assembly. I love them, and we've seen some success with them in the dirt track world as well, where a lot of times guys treat stuff like that as consumable, but you know, they've stepped up to our premium log and I think seen great service life out of it.
Awesome. Yeah, we didn't have any other questions in the chat, so I think that pretty well wraps it up, unless you have anything else, Kyle.
Now, let me look at my notes here again really quick while I'm saying thank you. I really appreciate you guys' time today. I know it's a unique time in our world, so I'm glad you carved out a little time to come hang out with us and let us share some info. One thing I might just mention on the back to the power planner. So if you're a catalog guy, which I am, keep in mind that on our website we have, I think, 2 or 3 times as many of the power planners on there, and that's a great place to just go, you know, reinforce that stainless on the suction side, suck through stainless, push through paper. You know, does a great job of laying out return line sizes, gives fitting recommendations as well. But don't forget about the power planner, and then the tech bulletins. You know, I think just the topics we covered today, there's 3 on regulators, there's 1 on cleaning filters, there's an actual case study on what happens when you use one of those little disc filters. I think there's 14 tech bulletins, and 6 or 7 of them, the fuel pressure gauge one. So if you were in this session and wanted more, dive into that tech bulletin page. Honestly, I think the biggest benefit is when you can forward them to your customer, forward them to a jobber, you know, while you're talking to them on the phone. And as an old friend used to say, if you like picking fly shit out of pepper, those tech bulletins are a pretty good place to start.
Awesome, sir. Awesome. Chris Crawford asked real quick, anything wrong with using stainless for pre and post?
No, that's in the carbureted world. No, that's a great question. I don't know how I missed that completely. So thank you, Chris, for bringing that to my attention. So the 100 micron on the suction side is to protect the pump and minimize, suction side restriction. And the suction side is 90% of plumbing issues or even performance issues will generally happen on the suction side. So then we get to that pressure side where we're pushing through it. And then we start looking at, okay, what are we doing with the fuel? An injector, we hold the face of our roller vane mechanisms at 2/10, I believe. I mean, it's, they're incredibly flat. But we can get away with a 100 micron filter on that suction side. On that pressure side, we're using that 10 micron to protect either the injector from our earlier session, protect that DI pump, that direct injection pump. So in the EFI world, we tend to see way more of the 10 micron. Same thing. That's why our microglass element for E85 is 10 micron. That being said, in that E85 car, we still want that 100 micron on the suction side, the 10 micron microglass on the pressure side, 10 micron paper and gasoline, the microglass and methanol as well, methanol and ethanol. But a lot of carbureted guys, they'll run the 100 micron on the pressure side as well, just for maintenance. And Lord knows a carburetor's not near as finicky about contamination as an injector, as an EFI style injector. So just looking at the, whatever's on the other side. That being said, if I was doing a Gen 2 tank and a carburetor, I would probably start out with the 10 micron paper just to get all that, all the stuff from assembly. And it's not always hard stuff. Sometimes it's mold release, that you might find in a hose or depending on what kind of plumbing you have. But fuel is just such a good solvent, it'll get all that out. So we could use the 10 micron paper disposable, just get that out of there after 100 miles, throw it away, and then put the 100 micron stainless in. But thanks for bringing that up. I missed that point.
Awesome. Yeah, nothing else right now on the chat. So
okay. Man, I really appreciate you guys letting me run long too. That was it's people think of it as a boring topic. Regulators are pretty simple. Filters aren't very sexy, but obviously I can talk about them for 52 minutes and have fun with it. So really appreciate you guys hanging in there for the long haul. Stay safe and have a great day.